I'm going to be opening up the scriptures today, and we're looking at the end portion of the book of Genesis. And we're actually in a series looking at the person of Joseph. Now, I don't know about you, but I find it really helpful with books of the Bible to try to remember, the content of the Bible, or content of the book rather, to kind of bring it down to some kind of structure that's easy to remember. And I did this throughout my studies as a way to just remember the content. So I'm going to give you one for Genesis. If ever anyone says to you, what is the book of Genesis about? You're thinking, well, I know there's some stuff in there. I know some of the things, I'm not really sure. It's about 4 events and 4 people. So if you can remember the 4 events and the 4 people, you're going to remember the content of Genesis. And so it's about 4 events. It's about the event of creation, where God creates a good and perfect world. It's about the fall is the second event, the fall of humanity as humanity turn away in rebellion from God. There is the story of the flood, and then there's the story of Babel. 4 major events in the first number of chapters. And then it's about 4 people, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. 4 events, 4 people. Easy way to remember what Genesis is about. And of course, the 4 people are a line, a lineage, descendants, great-grandfather, grandfather, father, and son. The promise of God, the covenant of God, snakes its way through those 4 lives as God brings about the nation of Israel, through whom the Messiah is going to come, as God is going to fix what happened at the fall. And so that's what Genesis is about. So we're looking at the 4th of the 4 people, the story of Joseph. And 2 weeks ago, Tim McIntosh was our guest speaker, and he took us through chapter 39. And then the week before that, Brian kicked off the series by looking at chapter 37. So very, very quick recap. Joseph, the favored son of Jacob, gets sold into slavery by his jealous brothers. And in that story, which is recounted in chapter 37, there's all kinds of family dysfunction going on. And there's all kinds of poor parenting. That family is not a good example for us to follow. There is favoritism, and there is infighting, and there is like selling your sibling into slavery. So certainly not that one. He gets sold to Midianite slave traders, who then take him down to the nation of Egypt and sell him to a man called Potiphar, who happens to be an officer of the guard. He is captain of the guard, an officer of Pharaoh, and the brothers go back and tell their father, Joseph died in the wilderness. We think he was attacked by wild animals. So pretty rough story. And that's how he ends up in Egypt. And that is the beginning of how we see the sovereignty of God at work in this story. And we're going to see it right throughout, and it's kind of already been pulled out a little bit, and I'll continue to pull that out. In Egypt, Potiphar's wife, who is likely in the house, kind of bored, her husband's busy, probably inattentive to her, tries to seduce Joseph, but Joseph was an upright, a moral man and refuses. Joseph, by the way, has been raised up within Potiphar's house. He's been given favor, and he's actually an overseer in the house of Potiphar and gained favor with him. And it's because not only is Joseph a moral man and a good man and probably pretty skilled and kind of warm and like a nice guy that people want to be around, but also because the Lord was with him. And that's our tagline. And we're going to see it throughout the rest of the story. God was resolutely with him. Potiphar's wife, annoyed at being constantly snubbed by this slave boy, decides to kind of get her own back, and so she ends up grabbing his robe after the most recent advance, and she cries rape. This Hebrew servant that you put in our house has tried to defile me, and look, when I screamed, he ran away, and I've got his cloak here. And so obviously Joseph gets thrown into prison because of that, and poor Joseph has another terrible injustice in his life. And it begins this this sort of cycle in his life. There's calamity, and then God raises him up because he's with him, and then there's another calamity, and then God raises him up. And we're going to see this snake its way through the story of Joseph. And it raises some questions to us. Are we going to do a switch? This is a good time to do a switch. Just talk among yourselves. Hello, hello. Am I good? Everyone can hear me? I'm not going to make a weird noise. So evidently, I can use mics. Excellent, thank you. Where was I? So the Lord was with him. So he gets elevated, and then he kind of goes through this cycle of calamity, being raised up, and calamity, and so on. This idea of being thrown into prison and gaining favor in a prison context, and God being with his people who are imprisoned, happens outside of the biblical text as well, and further in the biblical text. It's not only Joseph's story, it shows up in other places, but it also shows up outside of the biblical text as well. It's a thing. And I'm going to tell you a story. Before we read chapter 40, I'm going to tell you a story, and some of you may remember this story because I told it once before, about 4 or 5 years ago. About 4 or 5 years ago, I was in the North African desert, and I was with some other Alliance missionaries, and we were sitting in a room across from a Middle Eastern believer who was recounting his story of faith to us. And now he was not from that country. He was from another country, sort of in the Middle East, North Africa. He had fled from that country into the country we were in. And he's recounting his testimony through an interpreter, and he shared how he had met Jesus through this miraculous vision. And when he was describing it, when he was describing what Jesus looked like, it took my mind to the book of Revelation where Jesus is described there. It was exactly the same. And he didn't know who this was, but he did know that there was a Christian in his town who was a missionary, and so he set up a coffee with him, and he went and said, "This is what I saw," and the missionary interpreted his vision for him and said, "You saw Jesus, and let me show you in the scriptures where what you saw is described, like written down a couple of thousand years ago." And of course, this man was overwhelmed, and he committed his life to Jesus and became a believer. As he began to tell his story of what unfolded after his conversion, it was just remarkable and astonishing. I don't have time to go into a bunch of detail, but what I will tell you is just the bare bones of the story, and this is it. After he came to faith, he became an evangelist. He just wanted to tell everybody in his city about Jesus. But of course, he was in a Muslim majority city and country, and that was a dangerous thing to do and a forbidden thing to do. And so he soon caught the eyes of the authorities, and long story short, he gets arrested and imprisoned. He got thrown into an infamous jail in the city with some high-ranking Islamic State terrorists that had been thrown into that jail also. The prison guards had no time for this infidel, this Middle Eastern man who had sold out his religion and his tradition and his faith and followed a Western, they figure it's Western, it's not really Western, but had followed this Jesus. And so they had no time for him, and so they thought, you know what, let's just let the prisoners kill him, and then we don't have to deal with him. So what we'll do is we'll spread a rumor. And so the rumor they spread to the Islamic State terrorists is that not only this guy we just put into prison with you, not only did he become a Christian, which is enough reason for you to hate him, but we actually caught him informing to the CIA. Of course, he wasn't. But he was speaking to the Americans about the Islamic State. I mean, they just signed his death warrant. The guy's going to be lucky if he makes it to his next meal. Can you imagine? The remarkable thing about the story is that the man miraculously did not get killed by the prisoners. Of course he didn't, he was there telling us the story. But actually was afforded the protection of the highest ranking Islamic State terrorist in that prison. For whatever reason, he took a liking to him and he gained his trust. But really what we must conclude is, wow, God must have really been with him and really shielded him and really protected him. Believers being thrown into prison, but receiving favor against all odds being protected and even elevated, all because God is with them, is not an uncommon story. It's not exactly the same as Joseph's situation, but it's not all that dissimilar either. The end of chapter 39, we get another one of those favor moments. So Joseph has been thrown into prison because of the issue with Potiphar's wife, but God gives him favor with the prison guard there, and then the chapter ends. So he's on one of those favor things. So once again, being put into a difficult situation, a calamity in his life, a major injustice, but God raises him up and gives him favor. And so picking up in chapter 40, you can follow along in your Bible if you want to, or on the screen. It says this: "Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker offended their lord, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard." Who's that? Potiphar, remember? "In the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard charged Joseph with them." In other words, put Joseph in charge of them. This is where he was gaining favor and being given a role in the prison. "And he waited on them, and they continued for some time in custody. One night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own meaning. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled, and so he asked Pharaoh's officers, who were with him in custody in his master's house, 'Why are your faces downcast today?' And they said to him, 'Well, we've had dreams, and there's no one to interpret them.' And Joseph said to them, 'Do not interpretations belong to God? Please, tell them to me.' So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, 'In my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms came out and clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, and I pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand.' Then Joseph said to him, 'This is the interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to when you were his cupbearer. But remember me when it is well for you. Please do me the kindness to make mention of me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this place. For in fact, I was stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I've done nothing that they should have put me in this dungeon.' When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, 'I also had a dream. And there were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating of it out of the basket on my head.' And Joseph answered, 'This is the interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you.'" That wasn't so good. "And hang you on a pole, and the birds will eat the flesh from you. On the 3rd day, which is Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all of his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his cupbearing, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But the chief baker he hanged, just as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him." God's word to us today. Dreams play a pretty significant role in the story of Joseph, don't they? It was dreams that Joseph had in the beginning that actually got him into trouble, or rather telling the dreams to his brothers got him into trouble. It was dreams in this story that we just read. There's going to be dreams as the story unfolds. Pharaoh himself is going to have a couple of dreams, and he's going to need them interpreting for him. And all of the dreams that I just mentioned, they all have a prophetic element to them, right? They all have a predictive element. The bowing down to Joseph is going to happen at the end of the story. What happened to the cupbearer and the baker came to pass. And Pharaoh's, which we haven't got to yet, he's going to dream of 7 years of famine and 7 years of plenty, and those things are going to come to pass as well. They have a revelatory quality about them. They tell the future. They're prophetic. There is no suggestion in the text at all that these are just random collections of images and pictures and visions and storylines that are working their way out in somebody's subconscious as they sleep. No, these are purposeful. They're prophetic. They're revelatory, which causes us to conclude they must have been given to the passive sleepers by God. And this is where we see the fingerprints of God in his sovereignty over the situation that Joseph finds himself in. Chapter begins then with Joseph being joined in prison with two members of Pharaoh's court, the baker and the cupbearer, the guy who was in charge of his food and the guy who was in charge of his drink. And the cupbearer, of course, as you probably know, not only was making sure his glass was always full, but also would taste the wine before he has it to make sure there's no poison. So not a great job, I don't think. Right? Great for Pharaoh if it is poisoned and he avoids the poison, not so good for the cupbearer. So, this is what we have going on. We're told that these two individuals have displeased Pharaoh. We're not told how. We don't know why. We don't know what they did. It may not have been very much. They were at the whim of the mood of that leader, and so who knows? Who knows what they did, but there was some kind of offense. And they get thrown into jail, and it happens to be the same jail that Joseph is in. And so again, we see sovereignty at work. We're supposed to, as we read that, see that that is not a coincidence. It's purposeful. Now, I don't know about you, but when I think about that story, or whenever I've heard that story, I think about them getting thrown in this dank, tiny, dark, little rat-infested, disease-filled prison. But actually, it wouldn't have been like that at all. In fact, they were in the custody of the house of the captain of the guard. So Joseph didn't go anywhere because he already lived in the house of the captain of the guard. It's Potiphar's house. In the prison where Joseph was confined, that's where they get thrown. So they get sent to Potiphar's house. They're kept in custody there, which means they're being held until Pharaoh comes and sentences them. So they're being held in this place. They're not in the place where petty thieves from the lower classes would have been thrown. They're actually where former confidants of Pharaoh were kept. But later on, Joseph switches the Hebrew word for prison. He changes it in verse 15. What he's doing is he's explaining why he's there to the cupbearer, and he's appealing to the cupbearer, and he says, if this all works out, and you end up sitting next to Pharaoh again and giving him his wine, bring me up in conversation. Help me get out of here, because I've done you this solid, by interpreting your dream, and then you're going to get out because God told me. So help me, do me a favor. I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine. And so he's telling him in that and then he says in verse 15, for in fact, I was stolen out of the land of the Hebrews. That was my first injustice. And here also I've done nothing that they should throw me into the dungeon, not prison, dungeon. That may be what makes us think of a tiny, dank, disease-filled jail. Dungeon, not prison, not custody of Pharaoh. Now, the Hebrew word that's used earlier for prison can mean house or household or home. It can even mean temple. It can even mean family. And it's translated as prison in our English Bibles. That's where he was. So not dank, dark cell, but home, household, Potiphar's place. But dungeon is used for a different Hebrew word that is there in the text. And the Hebrew word there can be translated indeed dungeon, but also, and this is interesting, pit, well, or cistern. Where have we heard of those before? Chapter 37. So he's essentially in house arrest in Potiphar's house, and he calls it that, except in verse 15 he switches it to pit, well, or cistern. It's a clear reference back to chapter 37 when he was thrown by his brothers into where? A pit, well, or a cistern. Why did he switch it? Why did he say that? Why did he not say, well, I'm in prison in the house of Potiphar? Why did he say, to get me out of this pit, well, or cistern? Was he exaggerating to make his point? Maybe. Was he working out his own trauma of what his brothers did to him? Maybe. Or maybe he's simply establishing a link between these two injustices. It was unjust for my brothers to throw me into the pit in the first place and sell me to slavers. It was unjust for me to be accused of attempted rape by this woman who's Potiphar's wife. And I was simply trying to be upright and honoring and not sleep with my master's wife. So he wasn't actually in a cistern or a pit or a well. He, or maybe the author, is simply trying to put those two injustices together, I think, to hold them together, to help us to understand that cycle that I've described that Joseph was going through. When the two men come into the prison, the captain of the guard, Potiphar, tells Joseph, "You're in charge of these men." I stop for a minute. Did Potiphar just make Joseph prison warden? That's what it sounds like. He's in prison, but now he's in charge of other prisoners. He's acting a little bit like a prison warden. Why would Potiphar do that? Because Potiphar thinks that he tried to rape his wife. Why the favor to Joseph? That's a big turnaround. Well, somehow he had gained the trust of Potiphar because the Lord was with him. Maybe, and I mean this, the text doesn't say this and we're inferring this, but maybe Potiphar knew his wife too, right? And maybe he thought, Joseph didn't do that, but I got to imprison him because I'll lose face. Who knows? We don't know. So, the cycle, calamity, raised up and give him favor. Calamity once again, raised up and give him favor. Once again, now he's acting as prison warden as the Lord is with him. Enter God now into the lives of these two Egyptian men, and he gives them dreams and leaves them perplexed. And Joseph asks them, "What's wrong?" And they explain. And Joseph, ever the faithful, trusting man who has avoided going down the road of bitterness. There are so many people in our world who have bad things happen to them, not even as bad as what Joseph has had happen to him, but end up allowing their wounds to fester, and their festering wounds turn into bitterness, and their bitterness begins to drive how they live and how they act because they haven't properly processed their woundedness. Joseph has avoided this route. And instead, he boldly and trustingly declares, "Don't interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." And one at a time, they tell him their dreams, and Joseph interprets them. One is favorable and one not so favorable. But both include time, a time element, 3 days. In 3 days, this will happen. So on the third day, it's Pharaoh's birthday, and he agrees to let two prisoners come free, and it's those two, and Joseph's dream interpretation comes to pass. He reinstates the cupbearer, and he has the baker killed, and we're not told why. Joseph's interpretations were correct. He got it right. God spoke clearly to him. That must have encouraged him. I don't know about you, but if you were Joseph, you'd be like, God speaks to me through dreams. That's pretty cool. I'm happy with that. When I try to interpret them and I ask God the interpretation of the dreams, the interpretation seems to be correct. Well, that's pretty cool. I like that. Since all this has happened and all this is happening, God is up to something. Well, that's got to be pretty cool too, because maybe it's going to help me. I asked the cupbearer, if the favorable interpretation comes to pass and you begin to stand next to Pharaoh again as wine taster, put in a good word for me. Bring up my case. Tell Pharaoh about the injustice that I've suffered and see if I can get release. That would be great. That's just a small thing you could do for me. When it did come to pass, Joseph's hopes were probably raised. I don't know about you, but mine would be, I'd be thinking, this is great. God has done this, and now God has done this. Surely God's going to do this. Surely this is his purpose. Now, finally, after all the injustice that is done to me, and I know God is a God of justice, he's going to allow justice to be served, and I'm going to get freed. This is great. My hopes would have been raised. Except that's not what happens. The cupbearer forgets Joseph, and he continues to languish in jail. And in the next chapter, we're going to find out he's in there for at least another 2 years. Hopes dashed, crashing back to ground. Am I ever going to get out of this cycle? I'm sure Joseph was wondering. Calamity raised up, back to calamity, back to injustice, raised up, back to injustice. I'm sure Joseph felt pretty awful. Betrayed by a guy he helped in his lowest moment. And instead of returning the favor, he forgets about him. I imagine it felt pretty dark. Is my life just going to be a long series of injustices, followed by God raising my hopes, only to allow them to come crashing back to earth? It feels cruel. It feels dark. My hopes are dashed again. Well, you and I have the good fortune of knowing the end of the story. We can read it, and we're going to continue to go through it over the next few Sundays. We have the fortune of knowing that. We're able to read and see the sovereignty of God and how it weaves throughout Joseph's story, that even when Joseph must have thought, finally I'm going to be vindicated, and he's not, that God is actually still working out his purposes. And not only for Joseph, but for Joseph's family and Joseph's descendants, and in fact, all the people of Israel, and by extension, the people of the world. He's doing something incredible that Joseph could never have imagined. His dreams must have seemed like the bane of his existence at times. At times, he probably thought this is really cool, and at other times, he's like, enough dreams. I'm done with the dreams. I'm done with interpretations. It's not working for me. His dreams got him into trouble. It benefited others, but his hopes ended up dashed. But, church family, his dreams eventually will be the thing that gets him an audience with Pharaoh. It will happen. It's just like so many things in our own lives. It has to be God's timing. It will be his ticket out of prison, and it will be his pathway to influence, and not just in Potiphar's house anymore or in prison, but actually across the entire nation of Egypt. He's going to get some remarkable influence, and we're going to see that. If God had given Joseph an easy route, he may have gained his freedom, which wouldn't have been a bad thing, but he would have missed out on the incredible, mighty, liberating thing that God wanted to do through him and through his descendants. Something good may have gotten in the way of God's best. And so let me ask you, have you ever experienced anything like that? Have you ever really wanted something? Really wanted to get that job? Or really wanted to date that person? Or really wanted this opportunity to arise for you and present itself? You really wanted this thing, whatever it was, and you would have grabbed that opportunity with both hands if you could, but it just didn't work out. And maybe you were upset, frustrated, disappointed. Your hopes were dashed because of it, only for some other avenue to all of a sudden be presented in time that was so much better. Have you ever experienced that? I have. And maybe it wasn't easy. It was quite likely the harder route, and maybe you picked up some scars or some emotional wounds on the way. Like, we don't sugarcoat everything. It's not always the easy thing, but it was so much better. And with hindsight, you were able to look back and say, God, thank you. Thank you for not letting me take what I would have taken. Thank you for being Lord of my life and not letting me call all the shots. Because if I did, I would have missed this incredible thing that you were doing. I couldn't see it, but you could see it. And so we're going to go to communion in just a moment. In fact, those who are serving communion, if they want to go and get ready at the stations, I'm just going to say a few things about communion. Communion is the invitation to the table where we come to take some elements that represent and point to the body and the blood of Jesus. And during COVID, we had those little tear-off things, and over the last number of months, we've moved back to come into stations, and I love it because there's something about getting out of your seat and going to the table you've been invited to collect those elements. So we're going to do that in just a moment. And they represent Jesus, his body and his blood. And Jesus also took the much harder route to achieve the thing that was much better. There's a moment in the life of Jesus where he's in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he prays to the Father, would you take this cup of suffering from me? And if the Father had answered that prayer, Jesus' life would still have been good. Like, he still healed people, and he still set people free and delivered people and gave us incredible teaching. And he still loved people and did some incredible things. But Jesus, it wouldn't have been the best. Jesus needed to go the route of suffering, the route of the cross, the journey to crucifixion, so he could die and be raised in victory and provide a way for wayward humanity to come back to us. Remember what I said earlier about Genesis? 4 events and 4 people, all about the promise and the covenant that would snake its way through those descendants into the nation of Israel, eventually with characters like David coming on the throne, whose line from which Jesus, the Messiah, would be born. It's all linked and it's all connected. So best for Jesus meant way more personal cost for Jesus. And so this is how the story of Joseph kind of parallels the story of Jesus, and it makes Joseph a little bit of a type of Christ, if you like. And with that in mind, we're going to go to the table today, and we're going to go with thanksgiving for the sovereignty of the Father and his plan and his best and the sacrifice of the Son. So I'm